She was sitting there in her little house dress. He knew she'd done what she could to avoid becoming luminous and unattainable. Timidly and with respect, he was looking at her. He'd grown older, weary, curious, but he didn't have a single word to say. From the open doorway, he saw his wife on the sofa without leaning back, once again alert and tranquil, as if on a train that had already departed.
Do you believe in God? It's in me.
When I first started this channel, I made a sort of subconscious, unspoken vow to myself that I would never attempt to make a video analyzing possession. At least to me, possession has transcended being just a film and has turned into a living, breathing being, as enigmatic and ever-shifting as any person. And the thought of analyzing it, breaking it down into pieces and symbols meant to be easily consumed, felt almost sacrilegious. But when I first came across the writing of Clarice Lispector, specifically the first story of hers that I read, a short story called The Imitation of the Rose, I couldn't help but feel a profound connection between her work and possession. In The Imitation of the Rose, the main character, Laura, returns home after her stay in a mental hospital, and while trying desperately to return to normality, to her role as a housewife, she has a sudden breakdown at the sight of roses. When she is forced to part with their extreme beauty, she finds that it is actually quite easy to imitate them, possessing both their danger and their beauty. And with this realization, she is finally able to break free from her performance of femininity and transcend into something greater, something sacred. To me, Laura felt so reminiscent of Anna, as if they truly understood one another in a way others are unable to, as if they were speaking through time, non-humans existing among us, indifferent to the concerns of ordinary people and the mundanity of our world, since they both are in pursuit of something greater, something that is well within their reach. Divinity. This video doesn't exist to demystify the film. I wouldn't dare to ruin its magic by explaining it away, but rather this serves as an exploration of their desires and their place in the world, creating a temporal space where perhaps they can coexist. It is difficult to deny the images of a world that these Bible verses are creating. A woman born eternally guilty, a man as the image of God, and women born from men in forever submission to them. I am not here to shame or disrespect anyone's religious beliefs, and even some of the feminist philosophers whose work inspired the quote shown before remained Christian throughout their life. But like them, I do believe it is necessary to understand the impact that these words and ideas have had on women. And it is not as if these ideas have been long forgotten. I grew up Christian, so I have experienced firsthand that these ideas are very much still alive and breathing. In his essay, That They Be Keepers of the Home, the effect of conservative religion on early and late transitions into housewifery, author Charcot examines how Christian ideology impacts women's beliefs about themselves and their lives, finding that fundamentalism significantly increases the risk that a woman spends her early career as a housewife. He writes, Conservative Christian religious groups continue to affirm the requirement of female submission. A whole genre of conservative Christian literature touts the domestic role of women. Writers admonish housewives to let Christ or the Holy Spirit guide all of their actions, and submission to the husband is equated with submission to God. Maxine Hancock's Love, Honor, and Be Free begins with the thesis, resolved that woman's place is barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. Hancock builds her entire book around it, arguing that the freedom of the housewife and submission to God and husband make being barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen the best possible choice for a woman's happiness. Submission to God and husband also involves subordinating selfish interests in career, sexuality, and self-fulfillment for the needs of the family, particularly the children. Women who work outside of the home while their children are young are seen as the root cause of divorce, infidelity, juvenile delinquency, teen pregnancy, pornography, homosexuality, and male unemployment. The original sin perpetuates the idea that our punishment is to bear children and become the perfect wife, and that it is the weight we must carry. If we push off this responsibility, we are again blamed for any issues or non-issues that arise. We all carry with us the blame of the world. And even for those who didn't grow up Christian or even religious at all, this messaging is still reflected in the structure and seams of the world that we live in. I can't find the source of this exact quote, but it seems to be inspired by the works of feminist philosophers like Mary Daly, Rosemary Radford Ruther, and Carol P. Christ. They all had varying backgrounds in religion, varying beliefs, yet agreed that the current understanding and interpretations of Christianity negatively impacts women and how society views women, that it has been weaponized against women. Man enjoys the great advantage of having a God endorse the code he writes. And since man exercises a sovereign authority over women, it is especially fortunate that this authority has been vested in him by the Supreme Being. For the Jews, Mohammedans, and Christians, among others, man is master of divine right. The fear of God, therefore, will repress any impulse towards revolt in the downtrodden female. We who create life are told that we were made from men, that we are secondary beings. Women are punished for eternity, and divinity is centered around the image of a man, further upholding the foundation that allows men to view us as less, smaller, weaker, forever tainted and stained by the original sin. I am only one part of a much bigger tale. Her story has shaped a great deal of humanity's story. How many of us feel as if we are fallen women/people out of the gate, that our inherent credibility or value is erased upon birth? How many of us are controlled by the debilitating terror that any form of disobedience or independence will lead to social exclusion and damnation? How many of us feel cursed for our curiosity, forbidden to know what we know, living amid a culture constantly manifesting a pathological and patronizing disdain for our instincts? The myth of Eve has served as an eternal warning, an electric fence around our psyches, zapping our impulses to revolt or question. This guilt is an integral part of our experience as women. We were born into it. Eve's story haunts us and serves as a cautionary tale about female autonomy. Our ability to create life becomes our punishment, and we are made to believe that our role as women is to submit to our husbands and bear their children and to never be disobedient. And from there, my brain wanders back to this connection between Laura from Lispector's story and Anna from Possession. Both of these characters tried to exist and act as they should. Be a wife, be a mother, be obedient, and both were ultimately unable to hold back a light inside of them that was not of this world. Something sacred, something divine. Crying, sobbing, laughing, tears in her eyes 1 minute, smiling the next. What a state to be in. She has no control of herself. Female hysteria, an idea first proposed by Hippocrates, with the term originating from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. Hippocrates believed that certain physical and mental symptoms that women experienced were caused by her uterus moving around inside her body, pressing against her abdomen, her liver, and even her head. He asserts that a woman's body is physiologically cold and wet, and hence prone to putrefaction of the humors, as opposed to the dry and warm male body. For this reason, the uterus is prone to get sick, especially if it is deprived of the benefits arising from sex and procreation, which widening a woman's canals promote the cleansing of the body. And he goes further, especially in virgins, widows, single or sterile women. This bad uterus, since it is not satisfied, not only produces toxic fumes, but also takes to wandering around the body, causing various kinds of disorders such as anxiety, sense of suffocation, tremors, sometimes even convulsions, and paralysis. For this reason, he suggests that even widows and unmarried women should get married and live a satisfactory sexual life within the bounds of marriage. His descriptions of women are laced with repulsion and disgust. He portrays us as inherently tainted beings that require cleansing by a man, of course, as though we were born stained. The idea that women create toxic fumes suggests that we are naturally contaminants, not only to ourselves, but that eventually it will leak out of us and pollute the exterior world. He talks about women as if we are monsters, cold and serpentine creatures that evoke images of corpses and serpents, a reminder of Eve and a reminder of our eternal guilt. The Greeks viewed women as innately unstable due to their bodies, and this term, hysteria, with time grew into a weapon. This disease merged and shifted over time, sometimes even associated with the supernatural or demonic, and many women believed to have hysteria were accused of being witches. Some of the main symptoms, although they are never ending, are anxiety, nervousness, shortness of breath, sexual desire, irritability, emotional outbursts, a tendency to cause trouble for others, and so many others. Essentially, the term was used as a sort of catch-all for anything a woman did or could do that would be outside the bounds of what was deemed societally appropriate. For most of history, hysteria was believed to be a consequence of women not bearing children, and so the solution, as Hippocrates thought, was for these women to have kids, but only within the bounds of marriage, of course. A major shift in how the world viewed hysteria happened in 1889 when Freud and co-author Joseph Breuer published Studies on Hysteria. It discusses male hysteria for the first time, finally splitting from hysteria just being a disease that impacted women, and also they viewed lack of conception as a symptom of the problem instead of the root cause. They argue that hysteria wasn't physical at all, rather an internal emotional condition brought on by trauma and repressed desires desperately needing to be released, which could affect both men and women. Even though this shift from hysteria being out of the body to of the mind and exterior conditions was groundbreaking, still Freud went full circle, also viewing femininity as secondary, as a failure. He believed that women were dominated by sexual reproductive functions, again reducing women to only their bodies, even writing, "Women oppose change, receive passively, and add nothing of their own." He believed that we were simply born as mutilated versions of men, forever longing to have the physical body of a man and forever envying men because of it, even viewing our desire to have children as something related to our jealousy of men. Why does it always return back to this, to pregnancy? Patriarchy is not just a structure, but an ethos, one that prizes control and order, the imposition of clean rules on messy realities. The imagined pre-patriarchal rule of Tiamat is frightening because it is organic, fleshy, bloody, slimy, sexual, tied to a cycle of birth and death, governed by instinct and desire rather than set rules. The body governs itself. It breathes and pumps blood, not by command, but because it was born to. But it is also fundamentally ungovernable. Try all you like, but you cannot forbid your body to die. The world of the mother is, in Edmund Spencer's oddly germophobic but illuminating terminology, filthy and dirty. Being made of flesh, it dies like flesh, it stinks like flesh, it rots. It comes into the world coated in slime and blood, screaming. Patriarchy aims to clean up the mess. It reaffirms men and their importance by imposing artificial, male-created standards on organic, usually female-created flesh. Men subdue and hold dominion over mater, mothers through the use of tools and rules, artificial creations that allow one to bring a subject under control while also holding it at a distance. Laws, swords, guns, but also science, technology, medicine, everything that aims to discipline and subdue the chaotic female body of the world. The hysteria over hysteria is obviously deeply rooted, or entirely rooted, in the pursuit of control over women, and also the fear of women. We see this divide clearly in possession, Anna embodying the frightening but organic when becoming one with a slimy, bloody creature, and also giving birth to it on her own, a being created entirely of her own despair. She is the patriarchy's worst nightmare, a woman able to give birth by herself, with only herself, with her creation taking the place of both husband and child. She doesn't need anyone, she is entirely independent. Mark, like the patriarchy, wants everything to be clean and sterile. He wants to return order to their relationship. The divine order of family relations relies on the headship of a Christian husband, the submission of the wife to her husband, and the subordination of children to their parents. Without this pattern of authority, many conservative Christians believe that the family cannot function properly, and a host of personal and social problems will proliferate. Mark is not a religious man. In fact, he is actually very openly pessimistic when it comes to religion, but still he clings to this idea of what a man and a woman should be, desperately wanting to restore order to their family dynamic, with him in the masculine position as the husband, his image upheld by having an obedient and loving wife at his side. But ultimately, she is alive and divine and fundamentally ungovernable. In 1980, a year before Possession was released, the concept of hysterical neurosis was officially deleted from the DSM-3, and in the 80s, many feminists even reclaimed the word as it had become an embodiment of the systemic oppression against women. The film has so many overlaps with expressions of female hysteria and, of course, an emphasis on the struggles and loneliness of female performance, the pressure to be a perfect wife and a perfect mother. Even some of the blocking within the film mirrors common images of the hysterical or possessed woman. But the beauty of Possession is that she views this hysteria as something other. She understands that it isn't just madness. When all is stripped from her, she can see her own divinity. Both Anna and Laura are women who are most concerned with their own sacredness, and as hard as they try to contain it and act as they should, ultimately they can't. There have been women throughout history that have found ways to be close to God, like the saints who had visions of him or spoke to him, but what these two women are experiencing is not the same as the visions of saints, but rather divinity through madness, through hysteria, challenging society and its laws, and taking away the man in God. There have been those in various generations who were voices in the wilderness, who through very unconventional ways brought attention to the problems and oppression of society. These individuals were possessed with sacred madness. Many of these individuals were initially reviled and labels cast upon them, only later to be revered and their message embraced. They are able to challenge power and orthodoxy and teach lessons through a unique way of utterance and example. They call others to reflection.
Responsible as anyone else for the care of these bounties is the woman in the American home. Hers is the struggle eternal.
She was going to smile, so he could at last wipe that anxious suspense off his face, which always came mingled with the childish triumph of getting home in time to find her there, boring nice, and diligent, and his wife. Their transformation into divine beings and ultimate transcendence begins somewhere unlikely. It begins with their oppression, the forced performance of femininity, and the attempt to adhere to the ideals of what a woman should be: quiet and obedient, a wife and a mother. In The Imitation of the Rose, the main character, Laura, from the very beginning talks about coming back to normal life from the mental institution that she was in. She constantly insists on telling us, or herself, or no one at all, that she has returned, that she is finally well. She begins with, before Armando got home from work, the house had better be tidy, and she already in her brown dress so she could tend to her husband while he got dressed, and then they'd leave calmly, arm in arm like the old days. How long since they had done that? From the start, she informs the reader what is expected of her as a woman. She must clean the house and make herself presentable and beautiful, and then tend to her husband when he comes home, and that all of this must be calm. She must be calm and quiet and obedient. Her statements about what is expected of her as a woman are constantly contradictory in her deliberate choice of words, and she herself, at last, returning gratefully to insignificance. She is constantly making it a point how grateful she is to come down from madness, how grateful she is to be small and insignificant, because that is what is expected of her as a woman. Similar to my discussion of the film The Substance, she has two selves oscillating within her: the desire to be perfect as a being, like the extreme beauty of the roses, and the desire to be perfect to a man, more specifically her husband. But as women have been trained by the world, the perfection we desire is evil, wrong, immoral, vain, and the perfection from a man's perspective is what we should aspire to be. So with almost every other word, she jumps back and forth in her mind between these two selves, knowing her true desires but feeling dangerous guilt for them. No longer that alert lack of fatigue, no longer that empty and wakeful and horribly marvelous speck inside her, no longer that terrible independence, no longer the monstrous and simple ease of not sleeping day or night, which in its discreet way had made her suddenly superhuman compared to a tired and perplexed husband. Anna is similar. Although she seems from the beginning to be so far gone already, she constantly returns, thinking of her child or feeling guilt for what she has done and what she has become. She refuses to tell Mark what is going on with her, so he asks her questions. Are you afraid I won't like you? To this question, she nods yes, her face carved with remorse. She has kept it hidden like Laura, even though she has changed. When she returns to herself and her roles, she feels guilt over wanting to be perfect as a being, a kind of divine perfection. Like Laura, she has been playing the role of the wife and the mother, but she is deeply, deeply lonely. Her husband Mark is a spy who spends the majority of his time away from his family, so Anna is left alone to take care of their children and their home. In the very beginning of the film, we are shown images of a world that is harsh, cold, empty, desolate, broken down. Mark sits in a taxi separated from the world by glass. All of these visuals tell us, before we have even heard anyone speak, that the film is ultimately about division, and how this division between people, between men and women, corrodes and destructs their inner world and then the world around them. The two main characters exist as individuals before we ever see them together, and when they do finally see one another, she greets him coldly, her arms crossed, protecting herself and obviously uncomfortable, standing far from him, as if they are already separated. During their conversation at the cafe, after she has explained that she thinks they should end their relationship, he tells her that he doesn't ever want to see their son again. Despite his understandable pain and feelings of betrayal, abandoning his child is vile and reflects his immaturity. She makes it evident to us and him that he was never really around to begin with. She has been the one having to hold the weight of their responsibilities as parents, alone while he was away. When thinking of performance and roles of femininity within this film, I think of Heinrich's mother, who I feel a lot of sorrow for. She is older and reflective of a different generation, where she may never have been able to be fully conscious of the role she is performing. Being a mother is everything to her. It is her entire life. This she makes clear through her her words and actions, eventually even taking her own life because her son is gone, since she no longer feels that she has a reason to exist. Women are taught not just that mothers are not really people, but that when they become mothers, they will not want to be people anymore. A good mother, a true mother, is someone who gives up all claim on her previous roles or interests, who lives entirely for and through her children. If mothers so much as think about a life outside of motherhood, patriarchy tells us we are bad people. Worse, it tells us that we are raising bad people, ruining our children. The only way to save them is to sacrifice ourselves, and if they are girls, they will presumably grow up and get sacrificed to someone else one day. We say that a mother is someone who gives life. We don't mention that the life she'll be giving is her own. In the film, at first glance, Helen seems to embody all of the traditional aspects of a perfect wife. She is kind and thoughtful and deeply maternal and performs many of the motherly roles when Anna is absent. But when Helen speaks, her inner world depicts something completely opposite to how she is perceived by Mark. In this scene, Helen is speaking about something concerning Mark and Anna's son, something alarming, and Mark doesn't seem to care or even really listen. It could be from his disrespect towards women, disregarding their thoughts, or that he is simply so consumed by his own thoughts of Anna that she is all that he can bear to think about. And then he speaks as if his subconscious is speaking for him and says,
"I'm at war against women. Have no foresight. There's nothing about them that is stable. There's nothing to trust."
Despite his need for women, his obsession with them, especially Anna, an obsession that is slowly destroying his life, he speaks aloud these vague and generalized beliefs about women, mirroring so many that we hear even today, that we are emotional with no logic and thus untrustworthy and unstable. He makes these assumptions without ever considering their depth, because to men there is no depth. Women are seen as their performed ideals and not a fully fleshed out self. Helen immediately refutes this, saying,
There is nothing in common among women except menstruation.
She makes the point that women cannot be grouped together into one singular being, and continues by saying,
But I find pathetic these stories of women contaminating the universe.
Again, as if not really listening to her, he disregards her thoughts and then makes himself the victim. But I'm the one contaminated. A man wanting to own, to possess a woman, and when unable to, becomes possessed by her instead. As Helen walks to put her coat on to leave, she comments on his belief that he is the real victim and says,
Because you never feel free, do you? It's so sad that for you freedom seems to mean evil. And what about lack of freedom?
Now that Anna is performing less like the ideal woman, the ideal wife, the ideal mother, because now in some ways she is free, going and doing whatever she pleases, he views her as evil, despite the fact that all she is doing is acting similar to a man. When women act like men, they are demonized.
I don't want you to be like this. You know, when I'm away from you, I think of you as an animal or a woman possessed.
Mark obviously says this to wound her, but it also illustrates again how demonized and inhuman independent women are to him. He so badly doesn't want her to be like this, never considering what it is that she wants. It is easier for him to degrade her to an animal, instinctual and feral, or a woman possessed, not making her own choices, than to truly view her as a dynamic, multi-dimensional individual. Most of recorded history has been defined as male. In the West, white men have told our stories, written our laws, made our definitions, dominated our arts and academies. When female experience has been accounted for at all, it has usually been a man doing the accounting. Women are defined from the outside in terms of how they seem to men, rather than from the inside as thinking, feeling subjects. They are not fellow people, not even a different or worse variety of person, but simply the opposite of men, and hence the opposite of human, which leads to the question of how you can have sex with something that isn't human. In many myths, heterosexuality is portrayed as a kind of legalized And attractive women are alluring, predatory, half-human monsters, fairy wives, snake women, others whose beauty is a thin veneer over their dangerous and alien psyches. Extremity pain and discipline formed the foundation of female performance, making Anna's role as a ballet instructor devastatingly fitting. In this scene, Anna contorts the body of one of her students, much like you position the limbs of a lifeless doll. The young girl screams in agony, all while Heinrich films the scene, treating it as if it were an intimate portrait of the woman he loves, all while she stares down the lens of the camera, unflinching, as if to say, "See what you make us do. Does this look beautiful to you? Soft to you?" Ballet as an art form embodies all of the violence and artificiality of our expected performance as women. The stage curtains act as an elusive veil, shielding the audience from its brutal reality. Stress, fear, bleeding flesh, shattered bones, meals skipped to fit into the unhealthy mold of the ideal dancer, the ideal woman. Women compete with another as if for survival, since not everyone can be successful. And just as society views women as obsolete once they reach a certain age, similarly, dancers are discarded as soon as their bodies betray them, immediately replaced by a fresh new face, a fresh new body. But all of this artificiality is executed with such perfect extremity that the illusion prevails. The audience gathers to sit and watch as the beautiful girls seemingly float across the stage like dolls in a fairy tale world, while the real girls suffer and bleed under their artificial snow. When the girl she is teaching flees after being pushed too far, Anna turns to the camera and says,
"From now on, she'll know how much right to sing and she will. She's got in her."
On the surface, she is explaining the harsh reality of ballet, that you cannot be mediocre and succeed. By breaking her down, she will learn to be stronger, a better dancer so she can be successful, and won't have to settle down and become just a wife. And that she wishes that someone had told her this. But another, perhaps simultaneous interpretation is that she wanted to bring out anger in that girl, righteous anger, to make her conscious of its presence inside her. She forces her to not be silent and obedient and to fully embrace her rage, even if initially it manifests as anger towards Anna herself. When we are taught that our anger is undesirable, selfish, powerless, and ugly, we learn that we are undesirable, selfish, powerless, and ugly. By naturalizing the idea that girls and women aren't angry but are sad, by insisting that they keep their anger to themselves, we render women's feelings and demands mute and with little social value. When we call our anger sadness instead of anger, we often fail to acknowledge what is wrong, specifically in a way that discourages us from imagining and pursuing change. Sadness as an emotion is paired with acceptance. Anger, on the other hand, invokes the possibility of change and of fighting back. What I wish I had taught my daughter in that moment was that she had every right to be angry and subsequently demand that the adults around her pay attention to that anger. Only then can she feel she has the right to make demands on the world. In Possession, Anna subverts the typical ideas of what a mother and wife should be. Women are often believed to be naturally and innately kind and maternal, yet she contradicts this, abandoning her child because she is more concerned by other things. So Mark has to take over her role as the sole caregiver, performing all of the motherly responsibilities. He looks after their child, taking care of him, feeding him, bringing him to school, even though he almost immediately passes off most of these responsibilities to Margie and Helen, the two other women in his life. Most people watching probably feel a lot of empathy for Mark in this film, but if it was a woman, it would probably be different. Yes, of course, there would obviously still be empathy for her struggles, but the reverse of this situation has been so deeply normalized in media that there would be no switching roles, no subversion. It is expected of her to perform these roles, but not expected of the father. Why? In Siri Hustvedt's collection of essays titled A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women, she briefly discusses another book called My Struggle, where the author writes openly about performing responsibilities usually associated with women and housewives. She writes, In an essay for Slate, Katie Royf argues that the very same catalog of housewifely chores and the misery that goes along with it would not have had the same critical impact had My Struggles author been a woman. Royf is quick to point out that this would be true for both male and female reviewers. What if it were a woman moaning about motherhood and its frustrations, a woman filled with resentment about preparing dinner and doing the laundry, or a woman wishing she could just be alone for a while and write? Royf doesn't say this, but the beaten-down housewife is a stock figure. Although the joys and satisfactions of domesticity were romanticized well into the 20th century, that angel of the house has had her wings clipped. When a man becomes a housewife, when he lives a story that has traditionally belonged to a woman, is that story new or old? Let us be frank, any and every story sinks or swims in the telling. But still, it is fascinating to think of My Struggle as a narrative of what Simone de Beauvoir famously called becoming a woman. As Hustvedt stated, the beaten-down housewife is a stock figure, one we have seen time and time again. In Possession, Zuofsky recognizes the godlike power that exists in Anna, and he rates the film and the men in her life to support this idea. They are fascinated by and afraid of her, which is a position so far removed from how women are usually seen in life and depicted in media. I believe this is one of the reasons why women and young girls relate so much to her character, even ones who may not yet understand or relate to the themes of heartbreak and the brutality of separation. It is exciting to see this kind of depiction of a woman who doesn't have to take on traits that are normally associated with masculinity to be respected and feared. And this is one of the reasons why it connected so instantly with The Imitation of the Rose. Especially when I arrived at the line, he knew she'd done what she could to avoid becoming luminous and unattainable. Timidly and with respect, he was looking at her. When both Laura and Anna finally escape from the confines of the cage that is being a housewife, their stepping away from that role alters their husbands' positions in the world, as well as their psyches. In the oddly hermetic, paranoid world of the heterosexual white man, the dirty secret is that the anointed demigod does not feel all that powerful. Instead, he is beset by anxieties, feelings born of keeping up an untenable position, a kind of ongoing false self. Such are the feelings of men who are raised to believe themselves entitled to feel power but do not feel it. The man who rolls rather than carries a suitcase is in peril of becoming the weak woman or the swishy guy. He is taking a trip into the scary, polluted territory of women and gays, where the real man's manliness might be exposed as a flimsy front. The irony is that the underbelly of white male power, of the clubby, self-congratulatory, back-pounding, pugilistic posing, is extreme vulnerability. Every human being is capable of being wounded. And so in Possession, when Anna strips herself of her identity of the mother and the housewife, and Mark now has to take on those roles, he is wounded. He is wounded by the heartbreak, but also wounded by the stripping of his seemingly powerful identity as a man. A conventionally attractive white man with a nice job would seem to have all of the ingredients needed for the utmost societal power. Yet through Anna's actions and his new role as the mother figure, he recognizes how little power he has, how vulnerable he has become, and how flimsy this front of manliness really was all along. When she first leaves him, he begins to look dead, his face pale and lifeless, as he spends 3 weeks drinking alone in a hotel room. A deeply emotional reaction and time away that a mother would never be granted, and if she did act in the same way, would likely be shamed for it. In Anna's absence, he almost immediately reverts back to the mannerisms of a young child. His power and identity as a man has been lost because it wasn't strong enough to stand on its own. It needed to be held up by her. Ultimately, Mark desires, or rather needs, order.
Yes?
I must.
You must restore order. You must leave him.
Throughout the film, we uncover more about the inner workings of his character and how, compared to most of the other characters in the film, he doesn't have any sort of faith to hold on to. And so without faith, he needs some kind of expected order to his life. Throughout the film, he does everything he can to try to bring them back to normalcy, even if that means accepting Anna's infidelity or drowning in her madness with her. In his attempt to maintain order, he clings onto ideas of what he believes masculinity to be: violence, anger, anger and control. At one point in the film, when she attempts to leave, he threatens her.
Please don't make me force you.
You can stop me! I opened the window and jumped!
He views this way of taking action as the masculine thing to do, but it's the exact opposite of what she actually needs, forcing her into a cage after all of her loneliness and threatening her, claiming he could force her and probably has before. This pushes her further into the copy and paste role of a wife, possessed by her husband, and she would rather jump out of the window than be forced to live in that loneliness again. But her reactions never stop him from continuing on with his ideas of what it means to be a man. When Heinrich emasculates him by outrightly stating that he is not a man, rather a woman, this tears at his soul so badly, it is such a deep insult to him that it becomes his breaking point. He becomes even further unhinged, and in that moment, he kills Heinrich. As Hustvedt stated, this idea of a man becoming a housewife mirrors what Simone de Beauvoir famously called becoming a woman. In some way, he is being made to become a woman out of necessity or out of lack, or from not having the support of other men. And this only furthers the point that our ideas of femininity and masculinity are not exactly gendered, not existing naturally, but rather rooted in forced performance of societal ideals. Imagine that an actress was forced for years and years, continually and eternally, to live in the role of a character. Not only this, but she is also forced to live on the staged set of the play. The actress, forced into this eternal role, forced to live in a stage set, day in, day out, would begin with her memories and ideas of her true self, but over time they might merge with those of her character, and one day her real memories are either forgotten or have blended so fully with the personality and memories of her character that she can no longer differentiate them, losing her sense of true identity. This imagined scenario isn't far from the lived experience of most women, brainwashed into performing femininity only for us, the blurring of who is who, the line dividing the character from the real person are infinitely more blurry since we have been performing this role since we were born. This idea is also mirrored in Possession when Anna says, "And then I read that private life is a stage, only I'm playing in many parts that are smaller than me, and yet I still play them. I suffer, I believe, I am." In this scene, she is delirious, and perhaps this recorded moment is one of the beginning stages of her existential descent. She recognizes the performance, how artificial it is, and how small it makes her feel, yet for some reason she is still compelled to continue playing these roles. I suffer, I believe, I am. It becomes her identity despite it not being her own, and even their house resembles the structure of a set. It is rigid and harsh with an open structure and open doors, and the camera moves as if an omniscient voyeur, not attached to a single character and often mimicking a third-person out-of-body experience, floating above their heads, looking down on them. In The Imitation of the Rose, Laura struggles so deeply with performing as a woman that she has to think through every single action, every word spoken, even small body movements, and the way she places her body in a space. There, of course, is the option for us to break free. We can detach and rebel from this forced performance, but we would still be left with the grief of the version of us that we will never know. What would I have been like if I hadn't spent most of my life trying to be the woman I was expected to be? Which interests are my own? Does anything actually belong to me? She sat on the sofa like a guest in her own house that evoked the tranquility of someone else's house. Laura took so much pleasure in making her house an impersonal thing, somehow perfect for being impersonal. From this perspective, in her now completely fractured sense of self and identity, Laura manages to find something comforting in the forced violence of mundanity, something otherworldly, something that reinforces her own sacredness. Tranquility from it not being attached to her, simply an observer of an impersonal home with impersonal belongings that have nothing to do with her. As she focuses more on this distance between herself and her home, herself and her belongings, she becomes detached from even her own self. She called herself Laura, as if referring to a third person full of that gentle and crackling and grateful and tranquil faith, Laura. If she was to look down on her body from above, it would be as if she was simply an object, a wife as another object belonging to a house, belonging to a man. A woman must continually watch herself. She is almost continually accompanied by her own image of herself. While she is walking across a room or while she is weeping at the death of her father, she can scarcely avoid envisaging herself walking or weeping. From earliest childhood, she has been taught and persuaded to survey herself continually, and so she comes to consider the surveyor and the surveyed within her as the two constituent yet always distinct elements of her identity as a woman. She has to survey everything she is and everything she does because how she appears to men is of crucial importance for what is normally thought of as the success of her life. Her own sense of being in herself is supplanted by a sense of being appreciated as herself by another. One might simplify this by saying men act and women appear. Men look at women, women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. The thoughts expressed through this quote by John Berger are ones that I feel like most women and girls have had before, even if they didn't fully understand how this third-person view of themselves came to exist. I remember when I was growing up and still quite young, even the moments that I had alone in my bedroom still felt like moments where I needed to perform. It felt like I was always in a film, which makes sense because of my forever obsession with them. I wanted nothing more than to be perfect like the girls in films, who even in their moments alone were always poised and beautiful and fascinating. So I believed that I should be too, poised and beautiful in my false solitude so that everyone watching could see me as I would like to be seen. So in all those moments alone, I posed myself and did what I believed to be interesting and surveyed myself from outside of my own body. An object, a sight. It was a long time before I realized whose perspective this really was, and that the sensation was not unique to me, that I had never in my life really been alone in my bedroom, that I'd never consciously been alone with myself. In The Imitation of the Rose, now that Laura is back and well, or at least trying to convince herself and everyone that she is back and well, this pressure to perform and appear to be the perfect woman and wife is so stressful that it causes a dissociative and out-of-body experience for her. She extended the hand holding them. She talks about herself as if she is not herself, and her hand as if it is not her own. The way that she talks about herself, distant and unattached, yet still aware of who she should be, remembering her name and continuing the internal monologue that we are reading, yet feeling alien and understanding that it is her house, but it also isn't, feels deeply reminiscent of some kind of dissociative episode, either depersonalization, derealization, or both, which all makes sense considering she has explicitly stated her previous hospitalization. A majority of my visual autobiographical memories take place in the first person, but they may arrive as observer memories. I sometimes see my child self as a little girl on her slow and meandering route to kindergarten. Migraine patients have hallucinated their own doubles, walking alongside them. In the images that precede sleep, I have occasionally seen images of myself. In these unbidden experiences, I inhabit my own subjective position in the here and now, but in relation to a second self. It is as if the reflected body, the mirror image, wanders off to become a third-person object, a she. The third person sometimes flies in on a rescue mission to quash the unbearable feeling of first-person experience. In traumatic situations, it is not unusual for people to have out-of-body experiences. The non-person shields the first person. The observer floating above the room does not feel pain. Traumatic dissociation, depersonalization, numbing, and detachment are modes of escape from qualia. Although it makes a lot of sense that it could be some sort of derealization or depersonalization due to the extreme trauma and stress of hiding and then losing one's true self and mind while having to keep quiet and perform, it could also be something else entirely. But ultimately, it doesn't even matter. Without analyzing it, she feels disconnected and thus detaches, becoming alien and superhuman, and thus the beginning of defiance and divinity. Immediately after a car accident, I found myself frozen and incapable of movement. This paralysis was accompanied by an odd feeling of detachment, a lack of connection to myself, to others, and to the world. The sentences that ran through my head, however, were perfectly formed, highly articulate, and entirely rational. A brief episode of freezing or shutting down, of tonic immobility such as I experience, is a very old, evolutionary, conserved mechanism of the parasympathetic nervous system that is activated when a creature is under severe threat and that may help protect the organism from further harm. What an alligator or dog probably doesn't have, but that you and I have, is an internal narrator that goes on talking, representing the events as they occur, but without inappropriate emotional tone. My narrating I was intact, but it was not a familiar I. It was distant and unconcerned. My linguistic subject seemed to have floated away on its own, creating a strong sense of unreality because what was missing was not language or narration, but something far more primal, the emotions that should have accompanied having just undergone an experience that could have killed me. As we discussed before, Laura detaches from herself due to the stress of forced performance, loss of identity, and feeling the weight of being made to hide her interior world, because it is viewed by others as morally wrong, something to feel guilt over, despite her knowing deep down that it is powerful and beautiful. For Anna, perhaps her catalyst was extreme loneliness and loss of faith, leading to the creation and birth of a living thing made from her own despair.
The reason I worked with it this way was that here's a person so lonely, so deeply, both physically, as her husband was away, and spiritually lonely, that she actually can literally conceive another being without pregnation, from her own will or from her own loneliness, create this creature, this so-called monster, whom she can love and give her love to and feel loved. I hope that when you see the film, you don't think that she's just a crazy woman. I think that's very important because, okay, a film about a crazy woman, so she does crazy things. Too bad. I mean, it's horrible, but it's not about that. I think it's about reaching the limit of a self, and that can pivot and make you something else, and that despair can do that for you.
With her husband gone and having a non-fulfilling life, playing the role of a housewife, she is out of touch with her own identity, deeply depressed and alone. In this dark period of her life, she whimpers before God, begging, and feels as if he has abandoned her too. Faith was likely her last hope, and there is extremity to losing faith, a pillar that holds up most people's life and morality. From there, she miscarries Sister Faith, a physical and emotional trauma, but also a release of this pain. And from this great loss, she gives birth to a being to love, a being that is a mixture of God, husband, child, and lover. Much like the author of the quote at the beginning of this chapter, through a near-death experience, which in this case was a sort of existential break or descent, Anna likely entered a state of unreality, with her brain using that as a coping mechanism. I found myself frozen and incapable of movement. This paralysis was accompanied by an odd feeling of detachment, a lack of connection to myself, to others, and to the world. Through this existential crisis, she detaches from the world in some kind of trance or dissociative episode, feeling nothing.
I felt nothing for no one!
Except for the creature made of her own despair, hers alone to love and protect. The girls differ in their states of unreality. While Laura feels like a perfect person, alien and superhuman, this isn't exactly how it appears for Anna. With Anna's unreality being birthed from extreme loss and despair, it manifests as a severe detachment from her son, her husband, and the entire world. Although she does occasionally return to these identities and her role as a wife and mother, out of guilt or perhaps doubt. When existing in her now state of non-reality, not feeling human either, she doesn't feel concerned with abiding by any laws, rules, morals that exist for normal human beings. A blank slate, untethered from society and disconnected from humans and the social contracts of our world and our societies. She is existing disconnected from herself, others, and the world, disconnected from rules and morality, and also her foundation of normal faith has crumbled. Her soul has been released from normal concerns and instead has opened to grander ideas. And without this focus on muddied black and white human morality, she can see the world clearer and through a new perspective. Mark's humanness and limited thinking becomes boring and small and unimportant to her. Human feelings and human death feel so small in comparison to the God that she is becoming. For unexpectedly, he realized in horror that both the living room and his wife were calm and unhurried. He watched her warily, almost her enemy, and from which he was starting to no longer help noticing how she was sitting with her hands crossed on her lap, with the serenity of a lit-up firefly.
We are all the same, with different bodies, like insects, meat.
She makes these beliefs apparent in this scene. All humans are the same, they are all insignificant, reducing them to just meat. Reminding me both of Laura's comment about women being insignificant, from having that view pushed on her repeatedly by the world, and also Mark's extreme generalization of all women being the same. Here Anna states that so are all humans, small and insignificant, just meat. In another scene, she leans over, zoned out and detached as she puts meat through a meat grinder. With the way it is intentionally filmed and her numb, lifeless expression, it almost appears that she's feeding herself through the machine, and she seems accustomed to it. She is used to being an object made to be consumed and then disposed of. She feels that she has been used and abandoned by humanity and the people in her life, and so she will abandon them as well. In the same way that the trauma of the loss of her faith and identity is likely what led Anna into her state of unreality, the breakdown of a marriage is also extremely traumatic, especially for Mark, who seems caught entirely by surprise. At times, he also has feelings of detachment with no pain, mirroring her experience. But for whatever reason, perhaps his facade of masculinity crumbling in a way that he refuses to accept, clinging onto elements of perceived masculinity like aggression, or perhaps because he doesn't have the influence of the creature, he continues to return to the world. Anna makes a point of physically showing how detached she is from the human world and her own body, her own self, how little her life and body mean to her, by cutting her own throat with a meat slicer. It depicts this emptiness, but also the pain of the disintegration of a marriage, and also that they are all insignificant. Again, nothing but flesh, just meat. When she is gone, Mark picks up the same tool and cuts himself 3 times. Like Anna, he remains calm and silent, without flinching or screaming. His detachment, likely his brain trying to protect him from the pain of her leaving, mirrors her detachment from the world.
It doesn't hurt.
No.
In the same way that the film reflects gender performance and the disintegration of a marriage, it also places a lot of importance on faith and belief, and different ways of viewing God. Even the bookcase in their house that Mark rummages through when looking for clues about Anna's infidelity is full of books about various cultures and their religions. We don't know if these books belong to Anna in her search for company or meaning, or whether they belong to Mark.
There's nothing to fear except God.
For me, God is a disease.
Mark is deeply pessimistic about God, calling it in this scene a disease. It is interesting that they could be interpreting, in some sense, God as madness, and how well that thought fits in with this discussion of sacred madness or divinity through madness. Also, and more obviously, he views God as a disease, something which is contaminating and destroying the world, the perspective of a deeply pessimistic atheist or agnostic. Meanwhile, Heinrich, a man who has traveled the world and seems to be well-rounded in his views on different religions, states there is nothing to fear except God, essentially saying that he has moved past earthly pains, released himself from suffering and worry surrounding fears of the earthly world, possessions, and desires. This is what he projects, at least, despite him showing up at Mark and Anna's apartment looking for her, very much still concerned with earthly desires. But in this moment, he claims that the only thing that needs to be feared is God, and in response to Mark's words, he says that through disease we can reach God, just as Anna does. His poetic musings on divinity seem to change greatly when he is stabbed by Anna. He no longer describes her poetically, instead he becomes afraid and logical, saying she is crazy and sick. I guess he was right after all, that there is nothing to fear except God, and that God is in her.
Darkness is easeful, temptation to let go promises so much comfort after the pain.
In the film, we rarely, if ever, see Anna exist around anyone except men and the creature. In general, the housewife with young children at home usually does not have a social support system as extensive as that of her husband, who has regular contact with other adults at work. Performing the role of the housewife leaves many women vulnerable to the onset of depression because they have relatively few contacts with adults, a restricted lifestyle, less intellectual stimulation than the man or woman employed outside the home. Perhaps even more important, filling the role of the housewife often leaves a woman dependent on receiving emotional support solely from one person, her husband. A woman isolated only ever in the company of men that have the desire to possess her. But here she is with a detective, a queer man, and perhaps he feels safer to her in some way because of this. So she opens up to him during this sort of dissociative trance that she's in, and as a detective and someone who is slightly terrified of her, he plays along, providing her with comforting words, ones unfortunately mistaken by her for a deep understanding. Because of this, Anna trusts him enough to show him the creature, but when he sees what she has been hiding, he reacts violently, trying to kill her. Deeply hurt by this betrayal, Anna attacks him with more aggression and less remorse than her other kills. She beats him with milk and glass and writhes, moving in a primal, ritualistic way, similar to how she moved in the tunnel scene, a failed interpretation of the ballerina she could have been, detaching herself from the restrictions of order, poise, and obedience that had been forced on her as a woman. Something deeply interesting to me about this scene is her use of milk in his death and how it ties to the imitation of the rose. In the story, Laura is told by her doctor to drink milk every day to help her. This ritual consumption of milk becomes associated with returning to normality, or at least trying to, whereas in possession it is used as a weapon, something to bring death, or as an unsettling liquid mixed with blood at the end of the bed that she shares with the creature, or smashed against the walls and dripping out of her during her miscarriage in the tunnel. The use of milk as a symbol is fascinating, as it is often associated with both innocence as well as evil in films. Milk is also associated with femininity because of the milk our bodies create to feed our children, as well as the typical staple foods of a household, eggs and milk, often the responsibility of the housewife to get from the store, which feels even more intentional in the tunnel scene where we see her with the small grocery bag with eggs and milk, adding another layer to an already horrific scene, since it symbolizes birth, but also the death of the version of her that was the ideal wife and mother. The disturbing combination of bodily fluids and food in the tunnel as well as the bedroom, blood and milk and other substances swirling together in a deeply unclean and desecrated space, reminds me of ideas surrounding the connection between menstrual blood and decay. It is remarkable that 2 rules, not to touch the ground and not to see the sun, are observed either separately or conjointly by girls at puberty in many parts of the world. Anthropologist James Frazer wrote in The Golden Bough, girls were kept in seclusion, told to wear blinders or avert their eyes from others when in public, that her gaze may not pollute the sky. Frazer attributed all this to the deeply ingrained dread which primitive man universally entertains of menstruous blood, a dread men felt at all times, but especially on its first appearance. Many cultures forbid women from touching or making food during their periods. The specific variety of food varies from place to place. Milk, mayonnaise, raw meat, pasta sauce, canned vegetables, sweets, but the threat is always the same. The food will spoil. Bleeding women are agents of decay. Other women report being told not to attend funerals, touch flowers, they will wither, Frazer says, or hold babies who will sicken at the touch of a bleeding woman. Again, women are viewed throughout history as monsters, creatures, contaminants, but are forced to perform otherwise. In this apartment with the creature, she doesn't have to keep up appearances. She doesn't need to keep anything clean. She only cares for pleasure in the creature, so that is where her focus lies. The fridge is devoid of anything normally found there, nothing fresh or edible, and instead bodies are cut to pieces and the place smells of rot. When the detective sees the monster, he says, with Emmanuel literally translating to God is with us. And he is right. Mark at multiple points throughout the story mentions the death of his childhood dog, an event in his youth that seems to hold a lot of power over him. After Anna asks if he believes in God, his answer is delayed, but eventually, much later, he responds, "For me, God is still under the porch where the dog died, and on the branch of the eucalyptus tree, where I'd lie for hours and watch how the clouds change the color of the grass below." Mark mentions this story, I believe, 3 times throughout the film. It seems to have been a pivotal moment of his youth, climbing under the porch where his childhood dog was dying and watching. Perhaps the fact that it yelps in fear of what it saw as it died made him feel that there was nothing after, or that what comes after is not the good kind of God, but something darker. But in the same sentence, he mentions a beautiful visual memory of a moment from his childhood, on the branch of a eucalyptus tree, claiming that God was left there too. He knew there was something divine and extreme beauty, like Anna and Laura, but combined with the memory of the dog, his childhood self didn't know what to make of the combination, and so faith in God was left there, under the porch and on the branch of the eucalyptus tree. In many ways, Anna has become this dog to him, especially considering his saying that she is an animal in his mind when she is away from him, when she is not under his control. She represents this to him, and so part warped love or obsession and part morbid curiosity, he follows her under the porch, no matter how much bloodshed and immorality she is consumed by, because he wants to access the divine, or support his pessimism that there really is nothing. The dog isn't under the porch anymore. And she missed the roses. They had left a bright space inside her. In her heart, that rose she could at least have taken for herself without hurting anyone in the world was missing, like some greater lack. In fact, like the lack and absence that was entering her like a brightness. And the dust was also disappearing from around the mark the roses left. The center of her fatigue was opening in an expanding circle, as if she hadn't ironed a single one of Armando's shirts, and in the clear space the roses were missed. "Where are my roses?" she wailed without pain while smoothing the pleats in her skirt. She tried for a second to imitate the roses inside herself. It wasn't even hard. Imitation, noun. 1. An act or instance of imitating. 2. Something produced as a copy. 3. A literary work designed to reproduce the style of another author. 4. The repetition by one voice of a melody, phrase, or motive stated earlier in the composition by a different voice. 5. The quality of an object in possessing some of the nature or attributes of a transcendent idea. This specific definition of imitation describes the ideas behind Plato's philosophy of imitation, which he named mimesis. The core idea of mimesis was that Plato thought everything in our physical world on Earth was a copy of some more perfect realm of ideal forms, and so everything that we experience on Earth is an imitation of this perfection. So it exists as a sort of hierarchy, and I will use the rose from Clarice Lispector's story as an example. 1. Ideal form, the perfect and abstract idea of a rose, one that is eternal and unchanging, transcendent. 2. Physical objects, the rose that we can see and touch on Earth, which is imperfect since it is already an imitation of the abstract idea of the ideal form of the rose. 3. Artistic representations. A painting of a rose, which is an imitation of the imperfect physical rose, and so it is an imitation of an imitation, and even further from the ideal form. In The Imitation of the Rose, Lispector seems to take elements of Plato's idea, but also challenges it, intertwining his concept of mimesis with her own thoughts on perception, femininity, madness, and transcendence. Her use of the word imitation in the title and throughout the story carries many different meanings. Throughout the story, it is made apparent to the readers that Laura is using all of her mental space and energy to focus on performing femininity, but that she is only imitating femininity and normality, not actually being. She is aware of this, and so she suffers. Upon seeing the roses, she is shocked by their extreme beauty. They are so perfect that she even remarks that they could be fake. Roses are classic symbols of femininity, so this perfect femininity of the roses could be a reflection of how deeply she desires to be the perfect woman, even though she knows it would be fake. But I don't believe that this is what is going on. If they existed as perfected femininity, I think she would feel threatened by them in a jealous, perhaps even competitive way, but instead they awaken something inside her and it terrifies her. It terrifies her because the roses are a reminder of all that she could be: beautiful, extreme, dangerous, fleeting, and transcendent. Returning to Lispector in contrast to Plato and their ideas on imitation, the roses are more than an earthly physical object. They are a portal to transcendence, and Laura can see that. What she sees within the roses and why it terrifies her so deeply is that this divinity already exists within her. It wasn't even hard. The rose exists in its divinity without apology, without concern for who sees it, no concern for performance or any kind of artificiality. So when she surrenders to the rose, imitation moves from being an abstract, philosophical concept into a lived experience of profound transformation into something sacred. This idea is made even more evident by Laura's talk about the imitation of Christ, a sacred text about internal spiritual transformation. When they'd been assigned to read The Imitation of Christ, she'd read it with a fool's ardor without understanding it. God forgive her. She felt that whoever imitated Christ would be lost in the light, but dangerously lost. Christ was the worst temptation. When she talks about having to read The Imitation of Christ, she describes her experience of reading it as something filled with passion, but the naivety of a fool, having not really understood it in the way that she knows she was supposed to. Light and danger are two words that she uses when talking about the roses, so here it seems that she misunderstood the meaning of the text and why she was supposed to read it, and instead to her, it was a dangerous temptation to imitate Christ, imitate God, become divine, and surrender, because she knew it was possible, that it was there inside her all along.
No, there's the third possibility, like cancer or madness. Possibility I'm talking about pierces reality.
This scene is beautiful and profound, one of my favorite scenes in the film, and it provides so many parallels to Lispector's story. As she battles between faith and chance, she feels that there must be a third option. She toys with the idea of cancer or madness as this third option, which is fascinating considering this line in Lispector's story. And as with everyone else, each day wore her out, like everyone else, human and perishable. No longer that perfection, no longer that youth, no longer that thing that one day had spread brightly, like a cancer, to her soul. Again, the character oscillates between negative and positive words in terms of her madness that becomes divinity, comparing it to cancer, the way that it spreads through her body, taking over, but that it spread brightly, that it was perfection. The way Anna talks about madness is through the ideas placed on her by society and men, that this madness would make her view of the world abnormal, wrong, but she can see this thing, this divinity, and how this divinity, although she isn't aware it is herself yet, doesn't contort reality but breaks it, freeing her and opening up her soul. But even as she discusses this beautiful and profound idea, she knows how men would view her. The hysterical woman, the mad woman, the possessed woman. It might be through some sort of perceived madness that she reaches this third thing, but it isn't simply her being crazy. She knows this and understands this, but also recognizes that the men in her life will never see it that way. They make her question her own intuitive thoughts, thinking she might be stupid, and she knows they see her as an object, an empty thing that only exists to be owned and possessed by them. It isn't made explicit exactly when Anna's imitation moment happens, but it seems to me that it happens right before she comes home and, with brightness in her eyes, looks at Mark and says that God is in her. She has seen her own divinity like Laura. In Anna's version of imitation, the final step is entering their perfected forms, hers with lighter hair and both with green eyes, which is interesting considering this line in Lispector's story. She was a brunette as she obscurely believed a wife ought to be. To have black or blonde hair was an excess to which she, in her desire to do everything right, had never aspired. Therefore, as for green eyes, it seemed to her that having green eyes would be like keeping certain things from her husband. And in possession, green eyes are a symbol of keeping secrets from her husband and of perfection and imitation. The couple's final forms are adorned with green eyes, a secret being made and kept from Mark until right before their dual demise. In the ending of The Imitation of the Rose, Laura is able to accept herself, her madness, her divinity, her otherworldliness, her inability to be a normal human and wife. Her husband stands at the door and views her with fear and respect, something that for many women is impossible to even imagine. For Anna, since the beginning of the events of the film, she has been in some way respected and feared by both men, but also loathed and entirely misunderstood. During the staircase scene, she runs towards him, finally beaming. She is ecstatic. She has found her divinity, and through this divinity, shows so much love for him. This is what he wanted, right? No. Ultimately, he desired order. He needed to restore this order to their family and for them to perform their roles as a woman and a man together, but ultimately still separate. Her happy to show him their perfected forms, him reaching towards her with a gun to shoot one or the other. Who was to blame, the creator or her creation? To him, his copy isn't divine, it exists as his competition, a man that has taken his place, a more perfect man. There is nothing that he wants less. This doesn't return them to his so desired order. Instead, it leads him to a way of existing that he has no understanding of. Bullets rain down on them and they die side by side, reminiscent of Romeo and Juliet, or a grim, surreal version of Cinderella as her shoe falls off her foot on the long stairwell ascending into the afterlife. By the end, she is perfect and divine, and they are finally equal. Well, maybe equal, as their perfected forms still stand divided on two sides of a glass door, which feels like a callback to the glass divide we started with in the very beginning of the film, as if nothing changed. Perfected Mark wants to be let in, so maybe her double does have more power now. Regardless, they are finally the perfect equal couple, but shown by the impending doom of the apocalypse happening outside, this equality or her dominance would only happen if the world was to end, or if they existed as beings from another planet entirely.